Loud. Sorry about that. Been trying to be good about recording this and putting it online for you guys to review. Okay, so yeah, let's move on to Ethiopia, and then we'll sort of finish off with the Hellenistic period in a again very terse format, because that alone is a whole other course that could be taught, and then do a tiny bit of a review, sort of overview, overlooking everything. So yes, off your usual map, but this is sort of the area that we're talking about. So the southern part of the Red Sea, the Horn of Africa, and Southwest Arabia. We already looked at some of these guys a couple of classes back when we looked at Southwest Arabia with Marib and Shaba, I think was mentioned. But again, you don't honestly have to worry about this because they're I was toying with the idea of putting a map quiz on the a map portion on the test, but I decided that would just be too mean. Oh, look at the size of relief. Um, and besides, you don't have this map anyway. So, but just at least to sort of situate yourself, Adulis, Kohaita, Matera are sort of in. Well, basically, they're all in modern Eritrea. But keep in mind that that is a completely artificial political border nowadays. So the main culture for the Iron Age, basically all of the Iron Age, really is this Axumite culture that we come to know based on the city of Axum. Uh, but you know, although Axum is the best known, and it's sort of like the first, well, it's it's the biggest, shall we say, empire in the Horns history, if you will. It didn't just come out of nowhere. It was built upon an earlier society that we are really just starting to piece together now over the last 2 decades, what we call the pre-Axumite culture, or also known as Damat, uh, which I don't have on here. I guess it's on the next. You'll see it on the next. Oh, there it is, Damat. That the Damat, the kingdom of Damat is really the first kingdom that emerges in the Horn of Africa, and Axum is built on the roots of this one. Prior to the Iron Age, basically you just have a Stone Age culture. We just call it the LSA, Late Stone Age culture, and that basically goes from Neolithic until about 1000 BC or something like that. Why does it change? Well, it seems that okay, well, I'll come to that in a second. So the pre-Axumite culture in particular, it's defined by a very sort of specific, you know, material, like archaeological assemblage, pottery, tools, writing system that is found in northern Ethiopia and Eritrea. So the Tigray province of Ethiopia, and sort of central or south central Eritrea, which, if you've been watching the news over the last few years, that had been a real sort of hotspot where there was all this fighting happening with the Tigrinian government. And this is the area that I had been working in at least a decade ago. Jeez. So the pre-Axumite culture it's the first kingdom, sort of really sort of complex society that emerges in the region, and it starts around 800, maybe a little bit earlier, where every little bit of every season seems to push back a tiny little bit more. And so it stretches from the Rore region in Eritrea to the Mekelle region in Tigray, with some other stuff found in the west in what's known as Stana Kirkos, but we won't worry about that. The greatest concentration of the culture is in sort of the Aksum to Aksum to Mekelle region in Ethiopia, in the Tigray province of Ethiopia, and then up to the Matara region in Eritrea. We have sort of the full spectrum of settlements. We have hamlets, villages, towns, nothing resembling a city at this point, at least, and then also sort of ceremonial centers. Overall, we until recently, we didn't really have a lot of architectural remains from this culture. Basically, some stuff was found at Axum, and then at a neighboring town called Yeha, which seems to have been sort of the more important town in this pre-Axumite city, and then a number of places up in eastern Tigray and into Eritrea. Now, like I said, this for the longest time we have nothing but basically a late Stone Age culture in the Horn of Africa. And what changes is, if you remember that Sabaean culture that we talked about a couple of classes ago, who are becoming quite rich off of the trade in incense. And what they are doing is whereas although you can get a lot of incense all across Southwest Arabia, you have more of it in the Horn of Africa. And they realize this. And so very early on, they seem to be hopping across the Red Sea and basically working with the locals to collect incense and then trade it further afield to the rest of the Near Eastern world. And it's this contact and trade, and well, what you end up seeing is basically Sabaean colonies that are being set up is what really sort of spurs on the development of the societies in the Horn of Africa and directly leads to this kingdom of Damat, which will then eventually lead to the kingdom of Aksum. So yeah, we basically have this fusion of the local late Stone Age cultures of the Horn and the Sabaean colonists, if you will, sometime in the first millennium, around 850, probably even just a little bit earlier, but most of the securely dated contexts seem to be around 850. And what we'll see then is just like what we saw with something like Anatolia, where they take the symbols of authority, they adapt the religion to fit their own societies. And we see Sabaean temples, Sabaean writing being taken up by these Damat people, and even sort of, it seems, the concepts of kingship and whatnot. It's a great example of one of these things that we call secondary state formation, where one more advanced state influences the development of another one. So, we have a number of important cities on the Arabian side, on the Yemeni side at this point. There's Saba, of course, Kataba, Hadramat, and they all seem to be setting off. It's not really a united kingdom, and so they're sending off, the different cities seem to be setting off different colonies, and that seems to play a role in the competition and the push for more more how shall I put it? More adoption of the of the Sabaean culture, of this Yemeni culture, if you will, by all the different groups of people, because they're all interacting and with different cities, and each is trying to like outdo the other, if you will. So the Southwest Arabians, didn't really colonize it in our modern concept of colony or colonization. It was very much like that Uruk or the old Assyrian period trade, where they had these colonies that would graft themselves, small groups, if you will, that would attach themselves to a larger town and facilitate trade, and the locals are passively sort of absorbing and taking on the culture. Basically, at this point, both sides of the Horn, or both sides of the Red Sea, are benefiting economically from the relationship that is developing. And yeah, you have this cross-pollination that leads to the growth of both societies, really. Finally, by about 700 is when we really start to have the emergence of larger settlements, even, again, won't really call it cities, but at least very large towns that have monumental architecture, and including temples, something that might resemble a palace, and all pointing towards a stratified society with some pretty complex political organization. So the Sabaean influence. So they're obviously they're hopping across the Red Sea. They're landing on the coast of Eritrea around the Asmara region, and that seems to be the penetration point, if you will, with uh, into the Horn. Like the Red Sea obviously continues. If we go back to our map here, obviously the Red Sea, obviously there's a lot of coastline that they could be um, landing at and trying to reach the highlands, except for this is where geography once again plays an important role. If we look at the map here, you have the Red Sea, and then you have this thing here that's called the Danakil. The Danakil is basically the southernmost extension of the Great Rift Valley. The Great Rift Valley that we see in Israel that forms the where the Dead Sea is, and the Sea of Galilee. That's a giant, well, it's a fault line where you have two plates pulling themselves apart. The northernmost point is somewhere up in Turkey in the sort of the Marash area where that giant earthquake was last year, and it extends all the way down to Ethiopia. And so the reason why they're not basically trying to like come up to the Ethiopian highlands via Danakil, because you've got this incredibly low valley, a very dry and an inhospitable valley down here, and then you have very high mountains that you'd have to traverse. So it's actually easier for them to basically form all of their contact north in the Eritrea area around the city of Asmara, and then take the highland routes up. So this is why you have, when you look at sort of this blob on the map, is showing you the area where we're finding all of the evidence of Sabaean contact, if you will. Now, by contact, this means the evidence of these temples, Sabaean temples, evidence of writing, usually on these incense burners, and what else? Oh yeah, statuary and stuff like that. So when we look at this pre-Aksumite culture, so the Tigrinya is the language of the people of Eritrea and the northern part of Ethiopia. And Tigrinyan is this weird, it's a Semitic language, as opposed to the other languages in Ethiopia, and particularly Amharic, which are Cushitic. So they're more African related. Well, I guess it's Cushitic is Egyptian, ancient Egyptian falls under the Cushitic group as well. And the Semitic aspect of it is, well, because they have been having such close contact with the people across the Red Sea for such a long time, that it plays an important role in the development of their language. The earliest script that we have, and well, even the modern script of Ge'ez, is influenced by the Southwest Arabian Sabaean script. And what you also have to keep in mind is that, again, the sort of complex history of the region. You had the period where all the European powers were trying to like carve up parts of the Middle East and have their own sort of zones of influence, and they would colonize and whatnot. And Ethiopia and Eritrea were the areas that were colonized by, of all places, Italy. And so that plays an interesting role in their cultural development as well. Many of the early colonial era scholars, or well, researchers, if you will, assumed that because of this Semitic language aspect of Tigrinya, it was the result of basically people settling from the Yemeni coast, and it's that in general that is the way it is, although obviously it's a little bit more complex. It unfortunately also really sort of affected a lot of the early scholarship of the area, where they focused more on the Sabaean and Near Eastern context of the cultures, and ignored basically the local indigenous societies. Now with the script, we can read a number of things. A lot of and we're kind of dealing with the same problem that we have with the Sabaean culture across the Red Sea, that most of the inscriptions are very short, and they are sort of religious in nature. All of the gods that are referenced in the pre-Aksumite inscriptions are Sabaean gods. When we look at the religious architecture and the sculpture, it all seems to be Sabaean in nature, although there is some modern sort of adaptations, if you will. This, of course, then was perhaps overemphasized for quite a long time. The arrival of the Sabaeans themselves on the west coast of the Red Sea does not represent the beginning of the Damite kingdom, is what we've come to know. Is that the Damite kingdom does seem to be at least starting to forge or begin a little bit earlier on, but it's with the Sabaeans that it really starts to crystallize and take a more recognizable form. But when the Sabaeans end up abandoning the region, the Damite kingdom doesn't collapse; it continues on. You know, there is intense and highly influential contact between the Sabaeans and the indigenous populations of the Horn of Africa, but what we're slowly starting to unravel now is that it was not as long as many people had assumed, especially the earlier scholars. It really, the contact seems to have only been about 100 years or so, maybe. Even for such a short period of time, they clearly had at least a fairly intensive effect on the development of them. What am I looking at here? So yeah, our yeah, so the Kingdom of Damat is really sort of, as I've said before, it's the first real sort of state-ordered society or kingdom, even if you will, in the Horn of Africa. And this pre-Aksumite material culture is found over a large part of Eritrea and northern Ethiopia. Our earliest inscriptions, like I say here, probably date to about the 7th century. And the inscription makes reference to a king, a Melek. But well, or at least Melek in the Sabaean sense, but the pre-Aksumite people actually use the term Hiwat, and the king is an Achil. Eventually, you'll see Melek basically start to get adopted by the Damites in later periods, and even taking on that term of Mukharib, which again, there was sort of a chronological use in Southwest Arabia, so it's probably not too surprising that we have the same thing. So there is actually a king or Mukharib in Damat and Saba. Yeah, this joint term shows up on inscriptions that are found at Yeha, Adigalamo, and Kirkos, and yeah, a couple of other sites that you don't necessarily have to worry about. Eventually, though, you'll see a return to a more traditional name for king that will be either a Nageshi or Negos. This happens kind of in the later period, near the tail end of the pre-Aksumite, moving into the Aksumite period. Yeah, inscriptions initially they start off as being solely Sabaean, but eventually we'll start to see bilingual ones where you have it written in Sabaean and then also a language that will eventually be read as Ge'ez, but in the Sabaean script. Oh, so yes, the Sabaean contact, the big question, of course, is how exactly did it work and how far down did it go? Did the Sabaeans only have contact with the upper class, if you will, of the Damites, or did trade reach all the way down to the smaller villages? And this was actually the point of some of our research that we were doing. We were excavating a small village, basically in the middle of nowhere, dated to this time period to see if how intensive the Sabaean contact was and if it would reach down to these smaller people. And actually, it turned out that it did reach down, which again sort of puts a lot of questions as to how the social interaction works. One of the key things that is really sort of emerging is that, yes, we have South Arabian immigrants who are settling down in Ethiopia, but there's no evidence that they were in control. They were not politically dominant. They weren't colonialists in the modern concept that they came over and took over the country. Everything seems to point towards sort of peaceful trading contacts, if you will, that sort of build and become a little more intensive over time. The sites that we start to find the Sabaean remains at are very specifically chosen, sort of targeted in relationship to access to trade routes that would lead down to the Red Sea coast and then up into the highlands where a lot of the important goods would be found, in particular incense. The local leaders start appropriating the symbols of kingship, if you will, from this other society. The concept of kingship, even the terms of kingship as we see, and the religious architecture, the names of the deities, although it's a question of whether they're borrowing the religion altogether or whether it's a sort of a religious syncretism where they're linking the names to their own gods. And they're using writing for royal inscriptions, if you will. So it's clearly they had an important effect on the society, but if you keep in mind that, for the 5,000 years beforehand, you were just looking at low-level Stone Age hunter-gatherers living in small villages. It's not surprising that they had an incredible impact on them. Right. So who exactly were our people from Yemen having any contact with? It's all this, what we call it the late Stone Age culture, and it's found all over the place. Well, I should say late Stone Age cultures. They're not the same, obviously. Sorry, this is a good sort of map. This is where you can see the Danakil Depression running all along here. So it's a formidable barrier, and it's really hard to even take it by to go down from the highlands down into the Danakil by car, let alone by foot. And it's hot as hell, let me tell you, when you do go down there. But it doesn't stop people from traversing it fairly easily. So trying to understand the second millennium is a pain in the ass, to say the least. We basically just find lithic scatters in the landscape until the later part of the second millennium in Eritrea with the development of this Gash culture. There's no real architecture, very little in the way of pottery. There's just really not that much going on. At the beginning of the first millennium, before the Sabaeans have started to emerge, we are started to have major contact, if you will. We start to see the development of this thing that we call the Ona culture in sort of the area of Adulis and Asmara, sort of the coastal area and a little bit into the highlands, which are rich agricultural territory. But the most important thing about Asmara is they have a lot of gold mines. And so this is also what's probably driving some of the Sabaean contact. Not only are they going for the incense, but also for the gold from the Asmara region. So yeah, here you can see just sort of maps that show the different sites that have been found. Yes, well, the gold mines is also one of the main reasons why the Italians had sort of colonized the area as well. They exploited it to no end under their period of colonization. And we've struggled to find evidence of exploitation of the gold mines in the past. But in reality, it's really hard to try to find evidence of gold mining, especially since most of it is basically panning in rivers. So you're not going to find basically galleries where people have carved into the mountainside and try to dig it out, or having to smelt it and process ore to to extract the gold. It's a natural gold that's being found in the rivers that they're essentially panning for. So we're not going to find a lot of physical remains that could be linked to gold extraction. But everything seems to point to it being done, because we're in the few Ona sites that we've sort of excavated, we're finding evidence of, like of gold objects and stuff like that. So they're clearly getting access to it, and they're working it and selling it probably across the area. So this is why the Asmara region is so important for the pre-Aksumite culture. Now, these Ona ceramics, generally they're this red ware, the very fine sort of paste, if you will. They're sometimes burnished, and interesting enough, they'll also have this sort of black on top, which you should remember from, well, if you're in the class last semester, the pre-dynastic Egypt, the black top ware was very much like the same sort of color combination, this highly polished red burnish and then the black top. And then the same stuff was showing up 1,000 years later. We saw this year when we were looking at the Napatan civilization, where they have this black top ware. And now 1,000 years later, still it's showing up south in Ethiopia and Eritrea. The shapes aren't necessarily the same, especially by the time we get to the Ona culture. The shapes are less linked to the stuff in Nubia than it's more reflective of local things. So it's always a big question of, okay, just because they're polished red and black, does that mean that there's any sort of contact, or is that just they came up with the same ideas in different time periods? Honestly, it's one of these questions I don't think we'll ever have an answer to. It's just an interesting sort of pattern where you have the same sort of red-black color combination making it move slowly southwards from Egypt all the way down to Eritrea and Ethiopia. So that, of course, is the nice, pretty stuff, but more often than not, you'll find this very sort of drab brown ware that's very thick, all handmade, obviously. Same with the red, the red polished ware as well. But the brown stuff is very coarse, pretty ugly, with simple vertical incisions and so on. But it's with the Ona that we start to see the hints of, or well, we start to see the development of this Damat culture, the pre-Aksumite culture, which will then also sort of develop into the Aksumite culture. Once we start to look into the highlands, moving up into the Ethiopian highlands, into Tigray, this is where we start to find some more of these sites, in particular Keliguzai and Matara. Where we have these important settlements. Again, we don't really have a good feel for how big they are, but they're well known for their little architectural surprises, in particular this love of the stele that you see here. This is the one from Matara, I believe. And the use of stele will become an important thing in the Aksumite period, but it's used in the pre-Aksumite as well. And it also is found in that Gash culture site that's sort of in western Eritrea and in southern Sudan, and also seems to have some parallels to stuff on the immediate west coast of Yemen, in the Tahama Plain coast on Yemen. How exactly this whole interaction is happening, because we're looking at a period of 1,000 years of finding these things, is well, anybody's guess. But what we see in this case here, the one from, this is Matara, I believe, we have this large stele. You have our symbol of the crescent moon and the sun right out of the Sabaean culture, and there's even a bit of an inscription on there that makes reference to that god Al-Maka. As well as another sort of solar deity or goddess fuel, Dat Ba'adan. Kohaito is again up in sort of the hill country, if you will, where we have what looks to be like a temple with multiple pillars, if you will, kind of reminiscent of well, if you really want to make the stretch, reminiscent of say the Almaka temple at in Yemen there. But you also have a very large water reservoir that was carved, the date of which is still sort of hotly debated. Some people want to put it sort of later, but there's enough evidence that seems to point that it belongs to the pre-Aksumite or Ona culture period, which suggests that already in this early period in the highlands, they're developing complex water storage, water catchment, water storage techniques. Again, probably stuff that they're being taught by the Sabaeans, since this is a big thing in their culture as well. So the site of Yeha is perhaps the most important pre-Aksumite site. It's 25 kilometers, northwest of the modern town of Adwa, which is pointless for you guys because it's in the middle of nowhere. And you have a fairly big modern town that's built around the site, but it's basically in the archaeological material is sort of embedded in the town. It's dominated by this massive Sabaean temple that's constructed, and then a larger building that unfortunately has been poorly investigated, but it seems to be some sort of palace-like structure that they called Grat el Gabri. And then, there's a couple of shaft tombs nearby. This is what the temple itself sort of looks like. It's you've got this incredibly large building built out of beautifully cut stones, with stone paving in front of it. It was later reused as a church when Christianity came in, so they kind of did some alterations to the interior. But overall, there's Sabaean inscriptions in there. There's Sabaean statuaries that have been found in and around, and it just sticks out like a sore thumb because you've got this giant building in amongst basically a village of village or town of small mud brick and stone houses. These are sort of the reconstructions, good idea of the scale, the size of this thing, reconstruction of it, where they would have had pillars that sort of sat in front of it as well, similar again to what we saw in Yemen. In front of it, there's this small stele yard where there's some smaller steles that might actually be grave markers, but they haven't really been investigated because it's now officially a churchyard, so you can't go digging in the church itself. This is the large structure of Gatbel Gabri, which might be we're understanding to be a palace. At least it's something of decent size. It's I think 130 by 200 meters, made of cut stones. As you can see here, like very well cut stone. So whoever constructed this thing had access to a lot of resources, if you will, both money and people. Unfortunately, it's poorly preserved and people are actually living in parts of it, so it hasn't been really investigated and has left a lot of questions still. But at least it points to Yeha being sort of the most important site in the pre-Aksumite period. So by the mid-8th century, the Sabaean cultural influence seems to be going into a decline. At least this is what the newer data seems to be suggesting. And more local traditions seem to be reasserting themselves and sort of fusing with the Sabaean stuff. We're seeing this not only in sort of the writings, the statuary, but also starting to show up in the ceramics as well, where the early phase we have the red and black polished ware. Red and red polished ware, limited blacktop wares by the middle phase. So 800 when things are starting to go, the Sabaean influence is starting to wane. You have much more of that blacktop wares and also sort of a painted wares. And then the late phase has this sort of very brick red stuff, which will become sort of dominant in the later kingdom of Aksum. Now, what exactly happens to the Damite or the pre-Aksumite culture is obviously something of incredible debate. We know that about 590, Meroe in Nubia has become a larger, more powerful kingdom, concurrent with the decline of Egypt, if you will. And they seem to be, they become powerful, rich and powerful by taking greater control over the trade routes that lead obviously up to Egypt, but also down further south into into Africa, where all of the goods that all of these growing powers in the the Eastern Mediterranean, hell, even the Central Mediterranean and the Near Eastern world want access to. By 400, the state of Damat is basically in decline and will eventually be replaced by the Aksumite kingdom, which will start to grow at the same time. By 332, yeah, you have the development of Ptolemaic Egypt, and they basically take control of the Red Sea, and this is what basically makes the Damat kingdom collapse once they lose control over the trade between the Ethiopian highlands and the Yemeni coast. So the more famous kingdom of Aksum was built basically on the foundations of Damat. But it surpasses them greatly, both in wealth, sophistication, area that it controls. Eventually, they will end up taking control over parts of the Yemeni coast. They expand. Basically, they flip the they flip the table, and instead of the Sabaeans or the people from Yemen coming over and taking control of the Ethiopian highlands, they actually flip and take over parts of Yemen for a period of time. Aksum is, of course, probably better known as being the first Christian state in Africa. Even, we all the way down to the medieval period, you have kings from Aksum writing letters to various European monarchs. Its economy, they become incredibly rich based on, well, the same thing that Damat was becoming rich on, sort of the interconnected trade between the Mediterranean and the Near Eastern world. Although they tend to focus a little bit more on the Mediterranean than the Near Eastern, if you will. This interconnectedness is, of course, the source of its success, but as I say here, also led to some of the reasons for its decline. What you'll end up seeing is Egypt will set up ports basically as far south as modern Djibouti. They start building up Adulis, basically getting all of the access to the raw materials from the Horn, basically trying to cut out the kingdom of Meroe. And in doing so, they kind of start to mess things up. It's this breakdown of the trade, or the shifting of the trade because of the Egyptian connections, that this is what really sort of led to the decline of Damat and the rise of Aksum. And what you end up seeing there, at least the settlement data, seems to show a slow shift away from the area around Yeha. Just, Aksum and Yeha are really not that far away from each other, maybe like about a 1 hour drive or something like that. But Aksum is in a much larger, more fertile plain, and is tapping into different trade routes as well. Yeah, we start to see a change from still sort of a chiefdom organization to one that becomes much more politically and complex, with a lot more economic autonomy. And they really start to become a lot more powerful as they integrate with the Egyptian trading network, linking the Mediterranean, Near Eastern world, and then eventually even as far east as India. So the rise of Aksum really starts about 150 BC, where there is a chiefdom set on the hills overlooking the modern town of Aksum, the hill that's known as Beth Georgis. And Beth Georgis seems to Beth Georgis was the pre-Aksumite settlement, and by 150 it starts to become larger and more prosperous, if you will. We see the slow development of some elite residences that have only partially been investigated by the Italians. And then there's this large elite cemetery. Well, first there's a large elite cemetery outside of town, but then they build this one in the center of town, what's known as the Steely Field, which really sort of becomes the focus. Yeah, when you look at the material that's coming out of Axum, it really sort of shows its interconnected nature in that you have stuff coming from Nubia, coming from Yemen. You know, we even have tons of Greco-Roman stuff. Like you walk into the museum in Axum, and there's just a ton of Roman glass, uh, showing how tightly connected they were with the Mediterranean world. When the Romans take over Egypt, trade with the Red Sea really sort of intensifies, and this is why we have so much Roman material there, because they're trying to get access to, well, gold isn't necessarily the big thing. The main thing they're looking for is the incense, which is used a lot in basically all of the religious activities of the Mediterranean and Near Eastern world. So yes, one of the big problems with trade in the Red Sea was piracy. There's, you know, we've seen it popping up a lot over the last month or so, if you've been watching the news. And this is a major problem that has been going back all the way to the Roman periods. The Romans were having tremendous problems with piracy of groups from the Yemeni coast and also from the Horn of Africa as well. Uh, and Axum was obviously having these same issues very early on, and so they actually come into a sort of form of agreement with the pirates so that the trade can actually flow more freely, basically by the 3rd century AD. And this is why they become so important to Rome as a major trading partner, because they seem to be the ones who can actually deal with the pirates. And as this is happening, this is what all sort of leads to more political integration and basically the shift from individual chiefdoms to a larger kingdom focusing on Axum. So yeah, basically money is driving all this economic prosperity because of the money that comes from Red Sea trade, not only just the stuff from the Horn, but also using the Horn as a way to get across to places like India and whatnot. Between 325 and 285, we have a civil war that breaks out in Rome, and this basically starts to create a little bit of a power vacuum. They have to pull out of the Red Sea and concentrate their forces elsewhere. And so this is where Axum starts to expand and take over more of the trade in the Red Sea, and this is where it becomes its richest and most powerful, even starting to take over the west coast of Yemen, if you will. And so this is where we see them minting their own coins, as you can see here, and where we have the explosion of the great Steely Field in the central part of Axum, where we have these massive mortuary monuments and even also some of the bigger palaces, if you will. And this is also reflected in changes in sort of the concepts of religious ideology. The king seems to take on a semi-divine status as kind of the avatar, if you will, of Akbar on Earth. The monuments themselves, they're all basically one sort of father figure or well, it's a monument to a father, and then you'll have the son having his own stele not too far away, Tumen stele not too far away, all sort of solidifying the role of a royal line, being in control of the whole thing. And of course, with these massive monuments, the cemetery becomes a major sort of center for public ceremonies. By the 4th century, Axum's power has really sort of stretched all the way to Meroe in Nubia on the Nile, down south to the Ethiopian Eritrean highlands, down into the Ethiopian highlands, perhaps getting as far south as well, close at least to Addis, and then also across the Red Sea to southwest Arabia. What will eventually happen, though, is Christianity will arrive in Ethiopia. It arrives through the trade routes, if you will, and adopted as the state religion by the famous King Azana in 330 AD. And basically, Christianity has ruled since then. Axum has its own sort of metropolitan so sort of the head of its church, although they are tied to the Coptic Church in Egypt as well. They are on a totally different calendar. If they are basically, I think it is, how many years behind is it? Their calendar is technically 4 years and 2 months behind us. That's why the Ethiopian millennium in 2000 was celebrated long after ours, if you will, because they never did any of the Gregorian reforms that were done by the church in Rome. So gold was probably the seed that started the markets, as well as gold started the seeds. That was what really sort of financed, if you will, a lot of it. But what everybody's interests were of course the incense, frankincense, and myrrh. So the town of Axum is small, growing year by year, but still relatively unimportant in this early period. Axum isn't the capital of the Tigray region. That's actually Mekelle, which is about 3 or 4 hours away. But a lot of Ethiopians really sort of look at Axum today as kind of a religious capital, almost like a second Jerusalem is often the way it's sort of described. Because after all, this is also the resting place of the Ark of the Covenant, and also the throne where the royal kings of Zion, which the Ethiopian kings saw themselves as once Christianity was taken up by them, where they lived for a long time. So, like I said, the key to Axum's importance was the wide agricultural territory that surrounds Axum. It gets a lot of rainfall and has a long rainy season, basically running from June to early September. And there's tons of streams and springs, and the soil is very fertile, and they can actually produce more than one crop a year. And so this provides a good base for the population to sort of feed themselves, take up other forms of employment, if you will, but more importantly, it spurs on trade. So yeah, trade and also industries like working raw materials into prestige objects, and then constructing these massive monumental works like the stelae and the palaces, if you will. In the pre-Aksumite period, the center of occupation was on the hills overlooking the sort of classical and modern town, that Beth Georgis that I mentioned earlier. And then during the Proto-Aksumite period, occupation begins to move off of the Beth Georgis hills into the surrounding lowlands, probably to take greater advantage of the architectural or agricultural fields. The hillside, the Beth Georgis is not abandoned, but the focus of governments, of the palaces and the temples, etc., moved down south into the plain. The modern town of Axum, I don't really want to use the term city, evolved from a ceremonial center in the 1st century AD. At that point, there was perhaps 10,000 inhabitants, and it turns into sort of a commercial and administrative center for the Aksumite kingdom. The kingdom of Axum reaches its peak between the 4th and 6th century, like I said, controlling from the Nile in Sudan to southwest Arabia. By the 8th century, Axum kind of loses its importance as the focus of the country shifted west to the Aga region in the 10th century. And by the 10th century, the city basically goes into a precipitous decline. Today, the city is growing again, population of just over 60,000 people, I think, now. And since 2000, there's been a growth of a lot of infrastructure with an airport that was constructed and even their own university that was opened up in 2006. The construction of the airport was done by the Italians as part of their repatriation of some of the absconded goods, in particular some of the stele from Axum. They were returning it, and the only way to do it was they had taken it in 1937. We'll come back to more of that later, but and that when they finally were pushed to return it, the only way they could really do it was to construct an airport to be able to fly the stele into town and bring it up into place. But I'll come back to that in a little bit. Just outside of the core of the modern town of Axum is Takhamariam, or also known locally as Shiba's Palace, or also Dungur's Palace. It's in the western part of the town near what's known as the Dungur Stele Field. It's a weird sort of palace. It obviously does not, it doesn't bear a resemblance to anything traditionally seen in Africa, or in the Horn, I should say, and doesn't really bear a resemblance to most of the Near Eastern stuff, although there are some elements that do seem sort of Sabaean, in particular the sort of central, where's my guy? The sort of central tower that's in the center, or tower-like structure that's in the center of the building, which kind of looks like one of our towers from the Sabaean kingdoms. So yeah, it's, well, not even sure what shape you'd kind of describe that, square-ish, rectangular-ish, if you will. It's yeah, these monumental structures that were built on a stepped granite podium, if you will. So they built the podium and built the buildings on top of it. You have all these small buildings that are sort of linked together around courtyards and that central sort of pavilion. The walls themselves are divided by a string of courses of stones that are kind of popping higgly-piggly, if you will. The photo here, this is some serious reconstruction that was redone by the Italian archaeologists in the 80s, I believe. It was in much greater ruin when they came in there, and they've done a good job so that you can go and get a feel for what the place would have looked like. You have the walls are also punctuated by granite doors or windows, or what they call Axumite friezes, but they also seem to draw a lot of parallels from what we used to see in Yemen with the Sabaean culture. Other openings are framed by these rounded cross beams. Basically, you know, the wooden beams that would be used for flooring, if you will, in the structure. The ends of the beam sort of stick out of the walls, out of the stone walls, and these are it's a sort of an architectural technique that is very Axumite, and it has been given the weird nickname monkey heads. I'm not entirely sure why. But I believe so. Yeah, this is reconstructions and a good photo from afar of what the palace sort of looks like, and then this is that Gudet Stele field, basically another field that has a number of small steles and graves, etc. So basically, it's, you know, well, flanking the town, you have these various necropolises and cemeteries. Most of them are marked with, the graves are marked with these large granite stele standing stones. They can vary from being, you know, very rough and simple marker stones to some of the largest stones ever employed in human construction. So the Gudet Stele field is literally right across the street from Takhamariam. named after the Falasha or Jewish queen Judith, who apparently sacked Axum in the 10th century, at least according to local lore, even though she didn't. Uh, so in this case here, it's the stele is a cemetery, apparently for what probably is sort of the middle class, if you will, of the city of Axum, and is dated to the classical period, so the 1st to 4th century BC, maybe some going as late as the 8th. The wide variation in size and decoration and carving sophistication is probably due to the various degrees of social status of the wealth of the people. Yeah, some they range in size from rough-hewn stones that are only about 90 centimeters in height to the now fallen Stele of Sheba that you're seeing up on the left, as it's called, which is almost 6 meters. And no, it's not. It doesn't belong to Sheba. This is just the local lore names that have been associated to them. Some of these larger stones are actually solid blocks carved from a stone called nepheline, which comes from the same quarry as the Great Stele Field, some 4 kilometers away. And this nepheline is pretty interesting stuff because it's fairly light and it also rings with a metallic ring if you hit it. So it's also used as bells in some of the churches. Yeah, sorry, just more shots of this, the Gudit Stele Field. Right in the town of Axum, there is this one sort of elite residence or smaller palace. We're not entirely sure what to describe it, known as the Kilte. It's been partially excavated by a German expedition, sort of off and on since the 1900s, but has been seriously encroached by modern development. It's a smaller size. It's only about 30 by 30 meters in size. So that's why we think of it more as an elite residence rather than a palace itself. But you can still see some impressive, carving that has gone into the construction of this thing. It's some beautifully carved stones. But by far, of course, the organizational and technical skills of the Axumites is best represented by the stele found in the Stele Field. So these monuments are sort of a continued tradition of, well, basically of African traditions that we see in the Gash Delta. In theory, also, everybody likes to, of course, pull lots of parallels to the Egyptians as well, although there's no evidence of any sort of direct influence by the Egyptians at this point. They're made from single pieces of local granite, carved and transported from quarries that are about 4 kilometers away at Gobedra, and basically dragged over and then erected in place. In most cases, the stele represents a elite or royal burial tomb, which is a slight shift from what we saw in the pre-Axumite period, where the stele seemed to be used as kind of a religious element. Now they're being used in funerary situations. They're spread over multiple terrains. The Stele Field itself, the central one, is where all the biggest ones are, some of those most amazing ones. But we find Stele Fields basically all around the town itself. Due to their height and weight, the erection of the stele was not an easy task, obviously. The fact that many had probably already toppled before finishing the job should not perhaps come as too much of a surprise. Here you're looking at, this is some of the work again the Italians have been doing. They did a laser scan of the entire area to give you an idea of the tombs themselves. So on the western part of the Stele Field, you have the Tomb of the False Door that you're seeing here for obvious reasons. The tomb that you're seeing there with the false door, or the stone that you're seeing there with the false door, actually sort of laid down flat, covering up the entrance to it. It was discovered in 1972, believed to date around the 4th century. And it's a large, as you can see in the map, it's fairly large and complex tomb. The blocks are incredibly well dressed and very, very like finely cut. Perhaps this is one, in many respects, this is kind of the nicest tomb when you actually go crawling around of it. So you have an antechamber, an inner chamber, and then you have it's surrounded on three sides by a passage. Inside you have a sarcophagus with a cover made of again that same sort of stone that rings. Basically, yeah, it's kind of a basalt-like stone, but a much lighter one. Above the tomb at ground level, a rectangular, probably flat roofed building once would have stood in the area, measuring about 2.8 meters in height. Judging from the lengths to which grave robbers went through to get into the tomb itself, it's assumed that it once contained objects of great value, but they are long since gone. The tomb robbers worked hard to get into this damn thing. They went to town basically smashing the cover stone, suggesting that the tomb must have been originally fairly richly adorned or furnished. Perhaps the largest and most impressive, but not as pretty as the previous one, is the tomb known as Nefas Maucha. The place going forth of the winds, basically, is what it translates to. The name seems to come from the legend that at the foot of the largest stele lay tunnels where winds blew out any lights that would be brought into it. The tomb's dated to the 3rd century. Again, AD, consists of a gigantic single roofing block measuring 17 by 6.4 meters and weighs 360 tons. That was placed over the entrance to the tomb. The passages were roofed with granite blocks, and the inner walls are all sort of made out of smaller rubble walls, if you will. The stones are trimmed to fit together nicely, but there's also evidence of some metal clamps to kind of hold things into place. This huge structure was almost certainly intended to be covered over by earth as an underground tomb, but no entrance really survived since the largest stele basically fell and destroyed the west end of the tomb, probably leading it to never actually be used. Set on a hill about almost 2 kilometers away from in northeast of the Stele Field, you'll find the mausoleum of the tomb of Gebre Mescal and the tomb of King Caleb. It has this monumental portal, basically carved out of a huge single slab of granite that you're looking at here, making the tomb's entrance, and it's making the tomb's entrance, and then it's carved. It's got a carved with a number of sort of false doors on it as well. The portal leads down, so you come down these stairs, and then it leads into a passageway that has 10 side chambers. The tomb is fairly large. It covers 240 square meters, but unfortunately was damaged by tomb robbers who managed to dig through 1.5 meters of solid masonry to get into this damn thing. Like I said, they were desperately trying to get into these tombs. Going into these things has got to be, again, one of the more surreal experiences you'll ever have if you ever have a chance to get there. It's amazingly carved and finished, and then just deathly still. You hear absolutely nothing when you go into it. Yeah, unfortunately, robbed in antiquity, never found anything in it, but still a pretty amazing thing to see. One of the other tombs, the Tomb of the Brick Arches, as it's called, dates to the end of the 3rd century. This tomb is remarkably well preserved. It has 4 rock cut chambers divided into by a series of brick arches built with lime mortar. The tomb was excavated by archaeologists in 1974, and even though tomb robbers had managed to beat them to it, it was still partially intact, and they discovered fragments of gold jewelry, beads, bronze objects, weapons, and fragments of glass objects. Nobody knows who was actually buried in the tomb, but they found the remains of an elderly woman and a man in the rooms that still had some of the treasures, which clearly suggested that they were of high standing. This is one of the tombs that seemed to have been closed to the public for a long time. I never actually got to go into this one, and which is a bit of a disappointment. So a lot of the early discussions about the stele of Axum talk about the obvious genetic connections to the stele in Ethiopia and the obelisks of Egypt. Basically, this was kind of a little bit of racism, the idea that these African cultures could have ever developed these architectural wonders without the help of a more advanced civilization like the Egyptians. First of all, their use is totally different. Axumite stele are grave markers at this point, and Egyptian obelisks are architectural pieces that often sat in pairs at the entrance to temples and often served as pieces of royal propaganda and ideology through the inscriptions. Both obviously played a role in royal ideology, but one was more funerary, the other one was sacred. Moreover, like I said, there's a long tradition of using stele as funerary markers going back to the Gash culture in the Bronze Age, and maybe the Bronze Age culture across the sea in Yemen. And then, of course, the stele being used in the pre-Axumite culture as well. So, again, basically trying to link the steles that you see in Axum to the obelisks that you see in Egypt is just wrong. Found in another part of town is perhaps one of the largest bilingual inscriptions. It's written in Ge'ez and, well, actually, it's trilingual. It's Ge'ez, Sabaean, and Greek. It was created by King Ezana. In the text, you can read the king conveys his gratitude to Ares, the god of war, who was also essentially the Axumite deity of Mahrem. According to both the Greek and Ge'ez inscriptions, anyone who damages the stele will be cursed. It stands in the northwest part of the present day town of Axum, and is still standing where it was found. They built a little bit of a hut around it. And the stele dates from after Ezana's conversion to Christianity, basically revealing his identity as a Christian leader. You know, instead of referring to Greek gods, for instance, the inscription emphasizes the role of the king's faith in God, the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit in conquering various tribes. Yada, yada, yada. Oh, established. So just off to the side of the Great Stele Field is what's known affectionately as Sheba's Bath. Tradition holds that this was the Queen of Sheba's bath or swimming pool. It is not that. It is a large water reservoir, partly hewn out of the of one of the hills, and then so hewn out of the bedrock, if you will. Stairs lead visitors down to the water, and it's still used today as a source of drinking water for some people in the town. And when you look at the water, I certainly would not want to be drinking out of it, but you can actually see a woman collecting it down at the bottom. Annually in January, the bath is a point of focus for Axum, where the Epiphany is celebrated. It's also known as the Timkat festival that I talked about last day. So Mahrem, the war god, the equivalent of Mars in sort of the Mediterranean religions, was one of the, I guess, kind of like a patron deity for the early Axumite culture. You know, they still went by the Sabaean kings, but Mahrem seems to have been the one just for the town of Axum itself. The pre-Axumites and the early Axum or pre-Christian Axumites, I should say, sorry, worship the pantheon of this mix of Sabaean and local deities. Astar, or essentially Athar, were the main gods themselves. But the kings of Axum traced their ancestry back to this god Mahrem, this god of war, making them sort of semi-divine, if you will. And what you see in the, like, especially at the period of Ezana's conversion, you will see coinage where you will actually have the sort of a combination of both Christian symbols on one side and the more traditional uh, early Axumite religion on the other side, showing that the adoption of Christianity had not quite reached all of society, and Ezana recognized that as much. Yeah, on one side of the king, and one side you have the crescent and crescent moon, and the other side you have the cross, essentially. Yeah, second, third century sees a reversal of the traditional views of the relationship between the Horn and Southwest Arabia, with Axum taking control of parts of the Yemeni coast to basically control trade routes. And numerous inscriptions from Yemen complain about the interference by these Axumite kings who were basically messing with their ways of traditionally making a lot of money. How did Christianity come to Ethiopia? The tradition had it that you had two brothers, if you will, who come from Tyre in Syria. They were, well, they're actually, they are Syriac Christians, if you will, but they were living in Tyre, and they are traveling around the Red Sea, and they're captured captured at the town of Adulis and taken as slaves and brought to the Axumite palace. Yeah, they landed in Adulis. They were attacked by pirates, if you will, and their uncle and crew were massacred, and the two boys were taken into slavery and dragged off to Axum. Uh, Under the king El Amida, they created an atmosphere in the court for Christianity to spread, encouraging Christian merchants to come. They set up places for them to celebrate their masses, and eventually began converting the people. When King Azana comes to the throne, one of the brothers, Edesius, goes back to Syria, while Frumentius went to Egypt to get help converting the people of Ethiopia. He then came back, and he was appointed the bishop of Axum, and returned with a bunch of priests to start a mass conversion, of which he converts Ezana. And so with that, you see the royal court getting baptized and converted to Christianity. But then the spread of Christianity across the rest of the country is shall we say, linked to this group of people known as the Nine Saints. In the 5th century BC, or sorry, in the 5th century AD, you have a big split that occurs in the Eastern Church based on debates that were going on in Antioch and the Egyptian church based out of Alexandria. And a debate revolved around sort of the divinity and humanity of Christ, whether he was wholly divine, monophysite as the term is, or part divine, which will become the sort of the Nestorians. After the Council of Chalcedon in 451, the monophysites are basically banned, and you have a flood of anti-monophysite monks coming to Ethiopia from Syria. And so the Nine Saints were part of this group who basically run across the Ethiopian countryside converting people. They establish monasteries all over the place. They translate the Bible into Ge'ez to make it more accessible to the people. And eventually you will see Christianity become the dominant religion in Ethiopia. Now, because of its location and far enough away from from the rest of the Mediterranean world. The Ethiopian church evolves into something that is uniquely Ethiopian. They keep the Jewish Sabbath as opposed to Sunday. They use a lot of cisterns and drum music and ceremonies. That's probably something that's held that comes from the Coptic Church, and that in turn probably can be traced all the way back to the cult of Isis, if you will. The inclusion of the Ark of the Covenant in each church, what's known as a tabot. Um, dancing deacons, if you will, who would be dancing in front of the tabot, which is something, coming right out of the Bible for early Judaism. Circumcision, they're very big on magic spells. They have a lot of different festivals that you don't find in most other Christian communities. And interestingly enough, when you look at sort of the history of the Ethiopian church, you have far fewer heresies than any other church in Christendom. Not sure what you make of that. Now, by the 6th century AD, the environmental conditions, which had been really sort of ideal in Ethiopia at that point, start to change. It starts to become drier, and there's a lot more environmental degradation that starts to set in, and this then starts to shrink the crop base and the economy of the people. After centuries of constant population increase and intensification of cultivation, it really starts to have a bad effect on the land. This will start to lead to basically the slow decline of Axum because they've lost that agricultural base and people start to spread out, and this will really sort of set the scene for sort of the decline of Axum. And then, of course, various political and military snafus make things worse. 6th century, Axum enters a political alliance with the Byzantine Empire, and they launch a number of campaigns into Arabia to deal with the growth of Islam, and it doesn't go so well. By 577, the Sasanians have conquered Arabia. They take control of the Red Sea and Indian ocean trade, and basically cut Axum out of that trade, basically denying them that that other part of their stable economic base, the Red Sea trade. In the 7th, 8th century, Axum tries one last push, if you will, trying to take advantage of some political turmoil that was emerging in Southwest Arabia due to some issues with the Seleucids. Arab sources talk about Axumite ships working with various pirates, if you will, attacking parts of our major Arabian ports, if you will. In 702, Axum actually captures Jeddah, but then the Arabs start to push back. They take the Dakhla Islands, which are right across from Adulis, and eventually start taking more and more of the Eritrean coast, eventually sacking Adulis itself. And the Arabs have now basically wrestled full control of the Red Sea by taking Adulis and the coast of Eritrea. They've now taken full control of Red Sea trade, and Axum is cut off. 750, we see a shift in trade routes, and the Red Sea becomes less of an important trade route as the Persian Gulf becomes much more important, and that is basically the nail in the coffin for Axum. It becomes weaker and smaller, coupled with all the environmental stresses. Basically, it falls apart. All monumental construction action stops. The urban center begins to contract and becomes smaller and smaller. And by the 9th century, basically the kingdom of Axum is gone. All right. I went on a little too long for that. Sorry about that, guys. But luckily, this last part isn't too long. All right, so looking at the Hellenistic period and the Greeks in general. Well, the Greeks obviously have been around for a long time. The Mycenaean Greeks on the Greek mainland were there for the Bronze Age. Uh, from the 12th century to the 9th century, this is a period of, well, it's called the Dark Age because we don't really know what's going on. Later history talks about the invasion of Dorians, which is supposed to be the entrance of the Greeks into the Greek mainland, which there's absolutely no evidence for, because we know that the Mycenaeans were Greeks in the first place. But by the 9th century, we have the start of the colonization, the Great Greek colonization period. It seems that the cities in the Greek mainland had started to become larger and prosperous enough, and they started to spin off colonies, particularly on the west coast of Anatolia and into like Sicily and Sardinia, and well, Sicily in particular, and the Greek land, or the Italian mainland, sorry. Uh, the colonies that were set up were for the most part agricultural, uh, although some would be set up in places that would have access to important things like silver or iron. And the colonies would start to get larger and larger and eventually end up spinning off their own colonies. Miletus, the city of Miletus, was supposed to have spun off 90 of its own separate small colonies all across the Mediterranean and Black Sea area. As these colonies start spreading out all over the place, it results in a lot more cultural interaction with all these different cultures, and you see an incredible amount of cross-fertilization. Um, uh, and because of this cross-fertilization, we really see the development of Greek art and architecture, which again, most classes that you'll take, especially if you take it in a classics department, they'll describe it all as the brilliance of Greek culture, but it's all heavily built on other societies. The very famous Kouros statues, which are the sort of the quintessential early Greek statues that you see here, and they go into incredible detail about sort of the mathematical balances of proportions in these statues, are basically a complete ripoff of Egyptian statuary techniques or traditions that go all the way back to the Middle Kingdom period. If you look at them, same pose, foot out in front, arms to the side, staring upright. And again, if I sat through enough lectures where they would basically overlay a grid over the statue to look at sort of the balance of a proportion, if you will, between say the hands and the head. How close they are to the realism of the human body. If you'd overlay the same grid over the Egyptian stuff, and it's the exact same thing. The brilliance of the Greek world is really a ripoff of it's not a ripoff. It's cross-cultural contact and adoption and cultural adoption, if you will. It's more traditional classical scholarship that has tried to erase the Near Eastern connection, if you will, rather than what the Greeks would say themselves. The classical period of Greece, basically 500 to 336. Athens is, of course, the city that reaches its great sort of political and cultural heights, if you will, where we see the full development of demokratia, as it's known, democracy, which was the system of government that was set up under the Athenian statesman Pericles. But what you have to keep in mind is, even though everybody makes a big deal about democracy having been developed in Greece, when you actually look at what their definition of demokratia is, it's more of an oligarchy than actually democracy. Basically stays that way until structural changes that kick in the 4th century. This, of course, is the high point of Greek civilization. The Parthenon, the Acropolis is constructed. You have the tragedies of Sophocles, Aeschylus, and Euripides. And still a lot of contact going on between, well, all over the Mediterranean world, but especially with the Anatolian coast. So Ionia, which is on the west coast of Turkey, has already started to come under Persian control in the 6th century. But by 499, the cities basically decide to revolt, probably because of some prodding, if you will, by Athens, and they revolt from the Persians, and you even have some mainland Greek cities led by Athens come to their support, but they didn't really support them well enough. They lost, and 492, the Persians decide to take some retribution, but they're defeated at the Battle of Marathon. In 480, Xerxes is back, but unfortunately for Xerxes, he runs into the Spartans at Thermopylae, best known from that great Snyder movie. So the Persians are, of course, defeated at the Sea Battle of Salamis, which basically wipes out their navy, and Athens becomes sort of the dominant city. And this leads to the Peloponnesian Wars. Athens basically, once they defeat the Persians, they develop, for lack of a better term, too much of a swagger, and they start pushing a lot of the other Greek cities around. By 466, basically the Persians are defeated, and Athens forces the other Greek cities to be part of a league that's led by Athens, what's known as the Delian League. And this will eventually lead to war breaking out between Athens and Sparta, what's known as the Peloponnesian War. Basically, Sparta invades Attica. The people basically hid in their city walls. A plague breaks out. The Athenian fleet lands on the Peloponnese, winning some battles, if you will, but it really sort of ends in a stalemate with the Peace of Nikias. 418, the Peloponnesian War breaks out again. Sparta defeats Athens and all of her allies at the Battle of Mantinea, after which a coup happens in Athens. And basically then the region is sort of nominally in control by Sparta, then Thebes, till its eventual takeover by Philip of Macedon in 346 BC. So Philip of Macedon and Alexander the Great. So the period between the conquest of the Persian Empire by Alexander and the establishment, this is the period between the conquest of Persia by Alexander and the establishment of the Roman Empire, if you will. At this point, Greek culture and learning really sort of becomes, Greek becomes the lingua franca of the Near East and Mediterranean world. And Greek education really becomes the key thing as well. I say a lot of the patterns that we see developing into the Persians characterize the Hellenistic period. Well, that's because they took over. Philip of Macedon, who's the father of Alexander the Great, by 338, he conquers almost all of Greece, but then will eventually get assassinated later that year. What you have to keep in mind as well is, this is one of the funny things of history, is that if you read the Greek historians, they always describe the Macedonians not as Greek. They were never seen as Greek until the Macedonians actually conquered the Greek mainland, and more importantly, when Alexander the Great actually conquers the rest of the known world, and then they suddenly magically become known as Greek. Before then, they were just those nasty Macedonians. It's one of these great sort of historical twists and turns where the Greeks have appropriated another group who they hated for so long, and treated like a bunch of barbarians, until they actually become more famous and they push for the link between them. So Philip of Macedon gets assassinated, and Alexander the Great is basically shoved onto the throne at the age of 21. Yeah. And with that, he begins a campaign to take out the Persians and conquer basically the known world, um, starting in 334. Oh yeah, that's uh, one of the so he lands on the west coast of Anatolia and starts fighting the Persians there. He goes down as far south as Miletus, frees Miletus, but then does this weird sort of detour up north and east and goes to the city of Gordian, that which was that capital of the Phrygian Empire, if you remember from a number of classes back. Uh, the whole reason for that, apparently, and I kind of touched on that, so this is shot, that's the Mound of Gordian in the background, is that according to tradition, there was a wagon that was there that had a knot tied on it. It was the wagon that Gordius apparently used to come into Gordian, well, the town of what becomes known as Gordian, when he takes over the area. And it was an intricate and complicated knot, and there'd just been this long myth, if you will, that whoever can undo this knot would become the conqueror of all of Asia. And so Alexander was drawn to that. He wanted to be, his ego made it out that he had to be he was planning to conquer Asia, and so he couldn't do that unless he had defeated the Gordian knot. And so he makes this detour all the way up into central Anatolia, goes to Gordian, takes one look at the knot, and rather than trying to unravel it, just pulls out his sword and slices it in half. Essentially cheats at unraveling the knot. From there, he then continues south, where he will run into the Persians at basically at a huge battle close to the modern city of Adana. And then we'll continue across Asia till he eventually takes out the rest of the Persians. Now Alexander, by the time he eventually will die at a very young age in 323 BC in Babylon, he has basically conquered the Persian Empire, incorporated all of the Persian Empire, which gave him access to Egypt, Syria, Mesopotamia, Iran, and then pushed eastwards more into sort of Bactria, Sogdiana, and even trying to reach into India as well. And with his death, he had no heirs because he died young and was basically still campaigning when he had died, essentially. And so his empire was divided up by all of his various generals. Seleucus basically taking most of Asia, if you will, Ptolemy taking Egypt, hence the Ptolemaics, Antiochus taking Greece and parts of Anatolia. Ptolemaic Egypt obviously stays in control for a long period of time, of which one of the more famous members was Queen Cleopatra, of course. Focusing a little bit more on Ptolemaic Egypt, Alexandria. So Alexander set up a number of capital cities that went by the name of Alexandria or Alexandretta. So here you have where's my map? Where's my thing? There we go. So Alexandria in Egypt, you have Alexandretta, which was on the west coast of modern Iskenderun, if you will. There's another Alexandria that was set up. Where else? It's not, can't quite see it on the map. Well, anyways, number of Alexandrias that are set up. The more famous one, of course, being the one in Egypt in the Delta. So Alexandria, there's evidence that suggests that occupation really sort of began at the site in the 13th century BC, but it really sort of hits its heyday under the Ptolemaic period. It basically is a small, well, it was basically a small fishing village for a lot of its time, and then Pharos was an island that was off of it. Rakotis was the fishing village, and Pharos was the island that was off the coast of it, if you will. but Alexander will sort of choose it as being one of his royal cities, if you will, and it'll get totally rebuilt on a much larger scale. There's this huge grid system that was set up at the site that still basically dominates the landscape today, that was supposedly set up by Dinocrates of Rhodes. Alexander himself is credited with having designed the city walls. But this is just credit. We don't know whether it was really done for sure. Yeah, founded on April 7, 331 BC. This was a photo from the 1880s or something like that of Alexandria, where you could see still a lot of the classical architecture that was still sort of present at the turn of the previous century, if you will. However, now it is completely, all that stuff has basically been bulldozed and the city is completely built up as a modern town. One of the more famous things at the site of Alexandria is, of course, the Library of Alexandria. It's one of those institutions that seem to have grown larger and larger in history after it ceased to exist. Founded supposedly by Ptolemy II in 282. Or sorry, he started in 282, but somewhere around his reign. According to traditions, it housed over 500,000 documents that came from Assyria, Greece, Persia, India, many of the nations. Essentially, the basic idea was that any ship that came into the harbor of Alexandria, any text that they actually had to be handed over to the library to be copied and then given back to the various boats. And that's how the library itself grew. It was possibly destroyed by Julius Caesar in 47 or 48 BC, although that's hotly debated, if you will. There is, of course, it's been the source of many a mystery and many a story and many a TV special, but there has been nothing really preserved from this institution, unfortunately. All destroyed in the massive fire. The other famous thing from Alexandria, of course, is the Pharos, or the lighthouse that sat on the island. Supposedly it was built in the 3rd century by Ptolemy I, designed by a Greek engineer called Sostratus. It supposedly was a tower of red granite that was about between 115 and 150 meters in height. The idea is that it had a massive fire that sat at the top of the tower that could be seen by boats to lead them into the harbor. And then also, in theory, they had some very fancy lenses that turned this flame into a powerful laser that would burn boats. Again, some of the myths that develop afterwards. Basically, the tower itself had collapsed because of earthquakes that had happened in the first millennium, and eventually what you end up having is a Mamluk fortress that had been built on the island, basically over the spot of the lighthouse. This again is sort of the fortress, and what we've been able to actually find now, there's been a lot of surveys. I think I talked about this a couple classes back, where there's been a lot of underwater surveys that were done in the area in the 1990s, where they've been finding evidence of, say, Cleopatra's palace. Some people are even saying they found evidence of her tomb, and they found blocks of the Pharos itself. Okay, these are just some of the statues that were found in the water, that because an earthquake dropped, basically made the shoreline drop, and a lot of the palace fell into the water. There's that inscription that is a copy of the Naucratis inscription. But yeah, here is so this is our Mamluk fort. And basically what you're looking at when they did the surveys, you could see just an entire spread of granite blocks that they basically have come to understand that this is stuff from the Pharos that had tumbled down into the water with the final earthquake that brought it to an end. Oh, I seem to have screwed this up. Bear with me one second. Automation. So this Hellenistic period, this is where you have this incredible give and take really between the Near Eastern and Greek world. Uh, for quite a long time, the Near Eastern cultures were influencing Greece. A lot of that is seen best seen in religion, if you will, both from traditional Near East and Egypt. Egypt had an incredibly strong effect on philosophy and science as well. Uh, but with the Hellenistic period, this is where most of the Near Eastern world will become Hellenized. Greece, like I said, will replace Aramaic as the lingua franca of the Near East. And Greek culture will really start to become deeply embedded in a lot of the Middle Eastern societies. Still unique, but they would be heavily influenced by the Greeks. Uh, and so, yeah, this is just a map of the Hellenistic world uh, in the 2nd century BC. You can see all the different kingdoms that emerge after the fall of well, basically the fall of Alexander and the breakup of his empire by the different generals. So there's two key things that I want you to sort of walk away with here is that there's differences between the Hellenic, that is the traditional classical Greek world, and the Hellenistic world. You know, in key thing, government tended to be small scale, city oriented city states, if you will, and they were basically oligarchies, cities ruled by the rich elite. Whereas the Hellenistic world, we're dealing with monarchs and empires. Education, basically, you'd have Greek private tutors for the well-to-do. Physical training that would go at the gymnasium. Same thing would be happening in the Hellenistic world. That would at least continue. Language, classical Greek, although there's a lot of sort of local variations of it. When it comes to Hellenistic world, they've developed a Koine, a more traditional Greek that everybody would understand. But Aramaic still is kind of in use, especially in sort of the Mesopotamian world. Commerce in the Greek world, in the Hellenic world, is widespread, but compared to what happens in the Hellenistic world, it's limited, if you will. You have a lot more extensive trade in the Hellenistic period. Women basically had very restricted roles. Pericles has the famous line of women's role in politics is the amount of influence she exerts over her man. Um, uh, in the Hellenistic period, women have a little bit more autonomy, if you will. They can own their own property, they can own their own slaves, and they can actually act in their own defense, if you will. And yeah, you can even have some women acting as regents, as you see with Cleopatra. Slavery, widespread use. Nothing, no big thing there. Literature is the Hellenic period is our golden age of Greek drama and poetry. When you come to the Hellenistic period, they're basically just riding the coattails, if you will. And so on and so on. You can look this up online. Okay, so in the last couple of minutes, we'll do a very sort of summary thing here. This class was split into two halves, if you will, looking at the archaeology of the Near East from the Paleolithic to the Hellenistic period. And we're just looking at the second half, so the Middle Bronze Age, and the second millennium to the 4th century. Most of you, unfortunately, missed the first half, and so you'll miss some of the greater long-term developments. I've hinted at them in class, if you will. And at least I hope you still can sort of see that there were these broad evolutionary trends in the Near East running from simple to more complex societies. But of course, not without their little hiccups. Overall, there's this sort of centrifugal force that moves humankind from simple forms of social organization to more complex ones. Even when we have our hiccups, that driving force still seems to be there, bringing them back together. And that's what I hope you saw a lot through this semester. two important things that I want you to walk away from here. The first one is the importance of geography. The environment plays a significant role in the development of different societies. Not a deterministic one. It can open directions for a society to develop or can close them off as well. It can push them in different directions. The physical characters shapes our actions and our responses. And that's why you have, radically different societies over not that wide of a difference. A lot of that having to do with geography. The classic example is Mesopotamia versus Egypt. Egypt is 3,000 years of very steady society because you have the protected Nile River that floods on a regular basis, gives you all this amazing soil every year. So everything is very organized and straightforward. Whereas Mesopotamia, you have two rivers that flood at different times, which can destroy your crops in any sort of season. Flat open plains, so you can be open to invasion. So Mesopotamia is, as I've said often enough, the quintessential anthill that is kicked over on a regular basis and rebuilds. Two societies that are so completely different. And a lot of that has to do with geography. Yeah, sorry, this is Egypt, the poster child for environmental determinism. Basically, what's incredible about it is that you go from relative isolation, well, it has relative isolation, abundant of resources, and this resulted in the rapid development from small, simple villages to a heavily stratified state. But geography also allowed for one part of Egypt to basically not always be part of Egypt. The Delta was constantly infilling with people from the Mediterranean world, like our Hyksos that we saw. But this was something that was constantly happening, if you will. The Delta was an area that was the recipient of so much international contact and so much change, more so than the rest of Egypt. Mesopotamia, like I said, is flat open land, generally devoid of resources in the core. They have tons of good agricultural soil, but the surrounding regions to the north and east are filled with stone, wood, metals, everything they would need, which is what forced them to basically push out early from the homeland already by the 4th millennium BC, resulting in complex trading systems and pushing for the rapid development of writing and concepts of money more so than you will anywhere else in the world. And these trading systems will stretch all the way across the Near Eastern world and eventually lead to Egypt and the Aegean worlds as well. This allowed them to thrive and develop into these large urban settlements, the likes of which will not be seen in the world until the Hellenistic and Roman times. Like Uruk is in the 4th millennium BC is the size of Rome in Roman period. But like I said, being flat leaves them open to invasion, having numerous kingdoms being overrun by these groups in the east, the barbarians in the east. Also will eventually make them develop an aggressive foreign policy to make sure they don't get invaded again. Anatolia, Turkey develops early on into an important source of raw materials, but also developed their own significantly complex civilizations, independent of Mesopotamia, but still kind of tied to them, which you saw with places like Arslan Tepe or Liman Tepe. All of those were more previous semester. The key thing to keep in mind is that the ancient world was not a vacuum, much as we tend to look at them as the way we research them. I'm an Egyptologist, I only study Egypt, or I'm a Mesopotamian, I only study Mesopotamia. Everybody was interacting all the time. You have this constant interplay and connections between all the different regions. Ideas are borrowed, they're shared, they're built on. One region is not better than the other. And I point towards our Egyptology people for that. all the Egyptophiles who like to think of Egypt as the greatest civilization in the ancient world. Like, no, there were no one was really better than the other. They were all sort of different. Some of them would be in close contact for a period of time and then go off on their separate trajectories. Like Anatolia is a great example of that. Very early on in like the Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age, they have strong ties to the rest of the Near East, but after the early Bronze Age, they kind of go off and develop their own little thing. Uh, all societies have their complex architecture, uh, all sort of independent and different. There are, you can see some common ideas, common shared ideas, like, especially with the Persians, we know that they were bringing in Greek architects and Greek sculptors to construct a lot of their works. The Elamites with their weird ziggurats. These are concepts that are borrowed directly from southern Mesopotamia, but then they made them their own. Uh, there's a lot of cultural contact and sharing of ideas and building on them, if you will. Uh, even, social events like the Olympics, as I talked about when we looked at the Phoenicians. You can see the top photo, there's our aerial view of the Greek site of Olympia, which everybody sees as the first place that the Olympics were actually held, but in reality, the whole concept of the Olympics can be tied back to the Phoenicians and what was happening at the city of Amrit. Basically, what I want you to remember is that culture, it it develops, it evolves over time. It's not anything that drops down from the sky. We don't have to look for ancient aliens to explain how these amazing works that the ancient world did to us, or lost civilizations that we don't know anything about. We can see how they all developed on their own. Well, they developed themselves on their own, but also as the result of all the cross-pollination that was happening in the ancient world. Uh, Number one thing I hope you can walk away from a class like this from is that you can critically look at these bizarre TV shows that try to create this idea of an ancient, more powerful civilization that is the root of all of our stuff, because all it does is really diminish the importance of the work that the ancient people did. All right. So call that a semester, guys. Yep. Oh. So the format's basically the exact same. Keep in mind the state and identify. I might toss a couple of photos in there for the state and identify, but again, I won't be picking obscure things. It'll be something that you'll easily be able to remember. For the first two sections, the state and identify and the mix and match, it's everything from the last test until now. So you don't have to memorize the minutia from the first half of the semester. The second or the third part, sorry, will be the sort of the longer questions. That some of it will be specific to the second half of the class, but then other ones will be these sort of vague questions that allow you to pull on ideas from the first half of the class. You don't necessarily have to. It's better if you do, but it'll be general themes and concepts, like cultural evolution and being able to give examples of something like that. So, like, I hope I've given you enough hints in class where I say this is a great term for state and identify, and you start to learn sort of the thought process behind what I'm saying is important about these things. But yeah, overall, it's pretty much going to be the same.
So from class 11 all the way up to
Anything else? All right, well, I'll see you guys on Wednesday.